Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's attack report, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Your support is very important to us, so please subscribe. Go ahead and leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from, and click the like button. All of this because... I've always been a light sleeper, but that night something was different. The darkness in my room felt heavier, more oppressive than usual. My eyes snapped open, and I found myself lying perfectly still, every muscle tense. The digital clock on my nightstand cast an eerie red glow showing 2:37 a.m. Something had woken me. Not a sound, not a movement, but a presence. An overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned my head towards the window. The curtains were open, revealing the full moon hanging low in the sky, bathing my bedroom in silvery light. For a moment, everything seemed normal, peaceful even. Then I saw them. Two eyes, gleaming in the darkness just beyond the glass. They weren't the reflective eyes of a cat or a raccoon. No, these eyes glowed with an otherworldly amber light, and they were fixed directly on me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body refused to obey. Those eyes held me captive, paralyzed with a primal fear I'd never experienced before. As I stared, unable to look away, the shape around those eyes began to solidify. It was massive, far larger than any animal that should be prowling the suburbs of Oakville, Connecticut. The creature's head alone must have been the size of my torso. Shaggy fur outlined its form against the night sky, and I could see the glint of moonlight on wickedly curved claws pressing against my window. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It can't be real, I told myself. There's no such thing as... The word werewolf flashed through my mind, unbidden and terrifying in its implications. As if in response to my thoughts, the creature's muzzle pulled back in a snarl, revealing rows of dagger-like teeth. That's when I finally found my voice. A strangled whimper escaped my lips, barely audible even in the silence of my room. But it was enough to break the spell of paralysis that had gripped me. With a burst of adrenaline, I lunged for the curtains. My trembling hands grasped the fabric and I yanked them closed with such force that I heard the rod above creak in protest. The heavy material blocked out the moonlight, plunging my room into darkness. For a moment I stood there, my back pressed against the wall beside the window, gasping for air. The only sound was the frantic pounding of my heart and my ragged breathing. Then I heard it. A low, rumbling growl from just inches away, separated from me only by a pane of glass and a thin curtain. The sound vibrated through me, setting every nerve on fire with terror. "This isn't happening," I whispered to myself, squeezing my eyes shut. "This can't be real." But the growl only grew louder, and I heard the distinct sound of claws scraping against glass. My eyes flew open, and I stared in horror as the curtain bulged inward, the fabric stretching as something massive pressed against it from outside. I couldn't stay here. Any second now that window would shatter and the monster would be inside with me. My gaze darted around the room looking for an escape, a weapon, anything. Then I saw it, the gap beneath my bed. Without thinking, I dropped to the floor and scrambled underneath, pressing myself as far back against the wall as I could. I pulled a fallen blanket after me, using it to cover myself completely. From my hiding place, I could see a sliver of my room between the blanket and the floor. The scraping at the window had stopped, but I could hear heavy breathing, punctuated by occasional snuffling sounds. It was trying to catch my scent. "Please," I mouthed silently, not daring to make a sound. "Please go away." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I lay there, barely breathing, every muscle aching from the tension. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Werewolves weren't real. They couldn't be. This had to be some kind of vivid nightmare or hallucination. But the deep gouges I'd seen forming in the curtain had looked all too real. And the primal fear coursing through my veins told me that this was no dream. At some point I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion and terror. When I next opened my eyes, I saw pale daylight filtering under the bed. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I'd survived the night. Then the memories of what I'd seen came flooding back, and the relief vanished, replaced by a gnawing dread. Was it still out there waiting for me? I strained my ears, listening for any sound of movement outside my window. Nothing. Just the normal morning sounds of birds chirping and distant traffic. Slowly, cautiously, I began to inch my way out from under the bed. Every movement was deliberate, my eyes fixed on the curtained window for any sign of movement. When I finally stood up, my legs were shaking so badly I had to grab onto the bedpost for support. I stood there for several long moments, gathering my courage. I had to look. I had to know if what I'd seen was real, or if my mind had played some cruel trick on me. With a trembling hand, I reached out and grasped the edge of the curtain. Taking a deep breath, I yanked it open in one swift motion. Sunlight flooded the room, momentarily blinding me. I blinked rapidly, my heart pounding as my eyes adjusted. The window was intact. There was no sign of the monstrous creature I'd seen in the night. For a split second, I felt a wave of relief. It had all been a dream after all. But then I saw them. Deep, jagged claw marks scored into the wooden window frame, and on the glass itself, barely visible in the morning light, was a smeared handprint. No, not a handprint. A paw print, far larger than any animal I'd ever seen. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out as I collapsed onto the bed. It hadn't been a dream. The werewolf had been real, and somehow I knew with chilling certainty it would be back. As I sat there staring at the evidence of my nightmarish encounter, one thought kept repeating in my mind. Who would believe me? How could I possibly explain what I'd seen without sounding completely insane? The sound of my phone ringing made me jump. It was my best friend Sarah, probably calling to make plans for the day. As I reached for the phone with a shaking hand, I realized that my ordeal was far from over. The night might have ended, but my waking nightmare was just beginning. The first rays of sunlight crept through the gaps in my curtains, painting thin lines across my bedroom floor. I had spent what felt like an eternity huddled beneath my bed, every muscle tense, ears straining for any sound of the creature's return. As the room gradually brightened, I began to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I had survived the night. Cautiously, I extended one trembling hand from beneath the bedskirt, then another. My fingers curled around the edge of the mattress, and I slowly, painfully dragged myself out from my hiding place. Every joint ached from hours of immobility, and my shirt clung to my back, damp with cold sweat. Standing up was a Herculean task. My legs felt like jelly, threatening to give way beneath me. I leaned heavily against the wall, my eyes never leaving the curtained window. Part of me wanted to rip those curtains open, to prove to myself that last night had been nothing more than a vivid nightmare, but a deeper, more primal part of me recoiled at the thought of what I might see. "Come on," I whispered to myself, my voice hoarse and unfamiliar. "You have to look. You have to know." Inching forward, I reached out with a shaking hand and grasped the edge of the curtain. Taking a deep breath, I yanked it aside. Sunlight flooded the room, momentarily blinding me. I blinked rapidly, heart pounding as my vision cleared. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The suburban street outside was quiet, a few early risers heading to their cars for the morning commute. Then I saw them. Deep, jagged claw marks scored into the wooden window frame. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned closer, hardly daring to believe what I was seeing. The gouges were unmistakable, each one as wide as my thumb. No normal animal could have made marks like these. My gaze shifted to the window itself, and I felt my blood run cold. There, barely visible against the glass, was a smeared paw print. But it was massive, easily twice the size of my hand. The implications hit me like a physical blow, and I staggered back, collapsing onto my bed. "Oh God," I choked out. It was real. It was all real. The events of the night came rushing back with horrifying clarity. The glowing eyes, the massive shape, the bone-chilling growl. It hadn't been a dream. There really had been a werewolf at my window, Panic seized me. I had to call someone, had to get help. But who would believe me? Who could I possibly turn to with a story like this? My hands shook violently as I searched for my phone, knocking over books and sending papers flying. Where was it? I always kept it on my nightstand, but in my terror last night, had I knocked it somewhere? Finally, I spotted it peeking out from under a fallen pillow. I snatched it up, my fingers fumbling as I tried to unlock the screen. Should I call my parents? No, they were out of town for the weekend. My best friend Sarah? But what could she do? In the end, instinct took over. I dialed 911, praying that someone, anyone, would take me seriously. The line clicked, and a calm, professional voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? I need help, I stammered. There was something at my window last night, a creature, a monster. There was a pause, and when the operator spoke again, I could hear the skepticism in her voice. Sir, can you clarify what you mean by monster? Was there an intruder? No, you don't understand, I said, my words tumbling out in a rush. It wasn't human. It was huge, with glowing eyes and claws. I think it was a werewolf. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When the operator finally spoke, her tone had shifted from professional concern to barely veiled impatience. Sir, making false reports to emergency services is a serious offense. Have you been drinking or using any substances tonight? What? No, I protested. I'm telling you the truth. There are claw marks on my window. You have to send someone to see. All right, sir, the operator sighed. I'm dispatching an officer to your location. Can you give me your address? I rattled off my address, a spark of hope igniting in my chest. Maybe once the police saw the evidence, they'd have to believe me. It felt like hours, but was probably only about 15 minutes before I heard a knock at the front door. I practically flew down the stairs, yanking the door open to reveal a middle-aged officer with a weary expression. Good morning, sir, he said, his tone polite but disinterested. We received a call about a disturbance at your residence? Yes, I nodded frantically. It's upstairs. You have to see this. I led him to my bedroom, pointing at the window with a shaking hand. Look, the claw marks, the paw print on the glass. It was here last night, I swear. The officer leaned in, examining the window frame closely. After a moment, he straightened up, shaking his head. Son, I'm not seeing any claw marks here, he said gently. And there's no paw print on the glass that I can see. What? I gasped, pushing past him to look for myself. But as I stared at the window, my heart sank. The deep gouges I had seen earlier were gone. The glass was spotless, without a trace of the massive paw print. No, I whispered. No, this is impossible. They were here. I swear they were here. The officer placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. Look, kid, it sounds like you had one hell of a nightmare. It happens to the best of us. Maybe lay off the horror movies for a while, okay? But it wasn't a dream, I insisted, my voice rising in desperation. It was real. I saw it. All right, the officer said, clearly eager to wrap this up. How about this? Keep your doors and windows locked tonight. If you see or hear anything suspicious, don't hesitate to call us again. But try to get some rest, okay? You look like you've had a rough night. With that, he turned and headed back downstairs. I followed him numbly, my mind reeling. How could the evidence have vanished? Was I going crazy? As the officer got into his patrol car, I stood in the doorway, feeling more alone and terrified than I ever had in my life. The werewolf had been real, I was sure of it. But now, with no proof and no one believing me, what was I supposed to do? I closed the door, leaning against it as a wave of exhaustion and despair washed over me. One thing was certain. I couldn't stay here another night. But where could I go? Who would believe my wild tale? As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, I knew I had to figure out my next move. Because somehow, I was certain that when night fell again, the werewolf would return. And next time, A flimsy window and a hiding spot under the bed might not be enough to save me. The morning sun did little to chase away the chill that had settled deep in my bones. After the police officer left, I knew I couldn't stay cooped up in my house. I needed to get out, to be around people, to convince myself that the world was still normal. But as I stepped onto Oakville's familiar streets, everything felt different. Every rustle of leaves made me flinch. Each shadow cast by the morning light seemed to hide some lurking threat. I found myself scanning rooftops and alleyways, half expecting to see glowing eyes or catch a glimpse of matted fur. The peaceful suburban scene felt like a thin veneer, barely concealing the nightmarish reality I had glimpsed. My feet carried me almost unconsciously to Mabel's Diner, a local hangout where I'd spent countless hours with friends. The cheerful jingle of the bell above the door felt jarring, out of place with the dread that had taken root in my chest. "Well, if it isn't Jack Thompson," Mabel herself called out from behind the counter. "You look like you've seen a ghost, honey. Rough night?" I managed a weak smile as I slid onto a stool at the counter. "You have no idea, Mabel. I saw something last night, something impossible." Mabel raised an eyebrow as she poured me a cup of coffee. "Oh? Do tell. We could use some excitement around here." Taking a deep breath, I recounted what I'd seen. The massive shape at my window, the glowing eyes, the claw marks that had vanished by morning. As I spoke, I noticed the diner growing quieter, other patrons turning to listen. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. Then, to my dismay, laughter erupted from a nearby booth. "A werewolf? In Oakville?" chuckled Tom Baker, the local mechanic. "Kid, I think you've been watching too many monster movies." "It's not a joke," I insisted, my voice rising. "I know what I saw. It was real and it's dangerous. We need to do something before someone gets hurt." Mabel patted my hand, her expression a mixture of amusement and concern. "Jack, honey, maybe you should talk to someone. Stress can do funny things to a person's mind, you know." I looked around the diner, hoping to see even one face that showed a glimmer of belief. Instead, I saw only skepticism and poorly hidden smirks. The feeling of isolation intensified, a knot forming in my stomach. Just then, the bell jingled again, and Sheriff Dan Hawkins walked in. He nodded to the room before his eyes settled on me, his expression hardening slightly. "Jack," he said, taking the stool next to mine. "Heard you had quite the tale to tell my deputy this morning." I tensed, sensing the patronizing tone beneath his friendly exterior. "It wasn't a tale, Sheriff. I'm telling you, there's something out there. Something dangerous." Sheriff Hawkins sighed, accepting a coffee from Mabel. "Look, son, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. You've always had a wild imagination, but this is taking it a bit far, don't you think?" "But the claw marks," I started, only to be cut off by the sheriff's raised hand. "Which mysteriously vanished by the time my deputy arrived," he said firmly. "Jack, I'm going to give you some advice, and I want you to listen carefully. Lay off the late-night horror movies, okay? Get some sleep. And for the love of God, stop trying to stir up panic in my town. We've got enough real problems without adding imaginary monsters to the mix." The finality in his tone made it clear that the conversation was over. I slumped in my seat, feeling utterly defeated. As the sheriff turned to chat with Mabel, I slipped off my stool and headed for the door, ignoring the whispers and chuckles that followed me out. Outside, I pulled out my phone and dialed Sarah's number. If anyone would believe me, it would be my best friend since childhood. "Jack?" Sarah's voice came through, tinged with worry. "Are you okay? I heard some weird rumors." "Sarah, thank God," I breathed. "Can we meet? I need to talk to you. It's important." 20 minutes later, we were sitting on a park bench, the cheerful sounds of children playing nearby a stark contrast to the story I was telling. Sarah listened quietly, her brow furrowed in concentration. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. "Jack," she finally said, her voice gentle. "You know I love you, right? And I always have your back, but are you sure about this? I mean, a werewolf? In Oakville? Not you too, I groaned, burying my face in my hands. Sarah, please. You have to believe me. I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. She placed a hand on my shoulder, and I could hear the conflict in her voice. I believe that you believe it, Jack, but maybe you should talk to someone. Professionally, I mean, after everything you've been through lately with your parents' divorce and all, it wouldn't be surprising if you were under a lot of stress. I pulled away, feeling the last thread of hope snap. I don't need a shrink, Sarah. I need someone to believe me before it's too late. As we sat there, the sun began to dip towards the horizon. Long shadows stretched across the park, and I felt a primal fear stirring in my gut. Night was coming, and with it, the possibility that the creature would return. I have to go, I said abruptly, standing up. I can't be out after dark. It's not safe. Sarah's expression was a mixture of concern and frustration. Jack, please, let me help you. Come stay at my place tonight if you're scared. But I was already backing away, my eyes darting to the lengthening shadows. No, I need to be alone. I need to figure this out. Just be careful, okay? And if you see anything strange, anything at all, call me. I turned and hurried away, leaving Sarah calling after me. As I practically ran home, every instinct screamed at me to find shelter, to hide, to prepare. The town might be oblivious to the danger lurking in its midst, but I knew the truth. As I reached my front door, fumbling with the keys, I cast one last look at the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, the werewolf was waiting. And tonight, I had a sickening feeling it would do more than just watch from outside my window. Locking the door behind me, I began to frantically search for anything I could use to defend myself. As darkness fell over Oakville, I sat huddled in my living room, every light in the apartment blazing. The TV droned on in the background, some mindless sitcom that I couldn't focus on. My eyes kept darting to the windows, checking and rechecking that they were locked, the curtains drawn tight. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed unnaturally loud, each second bringing me closer to... what? I didn't know. But the dread in the pit of my stomach grew with every passing moment. A sudden thump from the hallway outside my apartment door made me jump, my heart leaping into my throat. I held my breath, straining to hear. Was it just a neighbor coming home late, or something more sinister? Get a grip, Jack, I muttered to myself, trying to slow my racing pulse. You're safe. You're inside. It can't get you here. But even as I said the words, I knew they were a lie. If what I'd seen last night was real, and I knew with bone-deep certainty that it was, then a locked door and some flimsy walls wouldn't be enough to stop it. I got up, pacing the small confines of my apartment, checking the locks for the 100th time. As I passed the kitchen window, something caught my eye. The full moon hung low in the sky, partially obscured by clouds. Its silvery light cast long shadows across the backyard, turning familiar shapes into looming monsters. That's when I heard it. A long, mournful howl, distant but unmistakable. It wasn't the yap of a coyote or the bark of a neighborhood dog. This sound was deeper, more primal. It spoke to something ancient in my DNA, triggering a flood of adrenaline and pure animal fear. No, I whispered, backing away from the window. No, no, no. It can't be. Not again. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking as I tried to dial Sarah's number. I needed to warn her, to tell her to stay inside, to... The screen went dark. For a moment, I thought the battery had died. Then I realized that every light in the apartment had gone out. The sudden silence as the TV and refrigerator shut off was deafening. Shit, I hissed, nearly dropping the phone in my panic. I stumbled through the darkness, banging my shin on the coffee table as I made my way to the window. The entire street was dark. It wasn't just my apartment, it was a full blackout. I stood there, my forehead pressed against the cool glass, trying to control my ragged breathing. The rational part of my brain insisted this was just a coincidence. Power outages happen all the time, right? But a deeper, more instinctive part of me knew better. This was no coincidence. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I scanned the street below. Empty. Not a soul in sight. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the pounding of my own heart. Then I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like nails on metal. It was coming from above me? My blood ran cold as I realized what it was. The fire escape. Something was on the fire escape outside my bedroom window. I wanted to run, to hide, but my body wouldn't respond. I stood there, frozen in terror, as the scraping grew louder, closer. With agonizing slowness, I turned my head towards my bedroom door. It was open, the window beyond visible in the dim moonlight. As I watched, a massive shape rose into view, blocking out the silvery glow. It was even larger than I remembered. Muscles rippled beneath matted fur as it crouched on the metal platform, its head easily the size of my torso. But it was the eyes that held me paralyzed, glowing orbs of amber that fixed on me with predatory intensity. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stared at each other, human and monster, prey and predator. I knew I should run, should scream, should do something, but my body refused to obey, locked in place by those terrifying eyes. The werewolf's muzzle pulled back in a snarl, revealing rows of dagger-like teeth. A low growl rumbled from its chest so deep I could feel it vibrating in my bones. That sound broke the spell. With a strangled cry, I finally managed to move, stumbling backward. My heel caught on the rug and I went down hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. As I gasped for air, I heard the screech of claws on glass. The window. It was trying to get in. Panic gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I scrambled to my feet and ran for the front door, not daring to look back. My fingers fumbled with the locks, precious seconds ticking by as I struggled to open them. Behind me, I heard the sound of shattering glass. A triumphant howl filled the apartment, chilling me to my very core. Finally, the door opened. I burst into the hallway, my bare feet slapping against the cold tiles as I ran for the stairs. The elevator was useless without power, and I didn't dare risk being trapped in a metal box with that thing. As I flew down the stairs, taking them 2 and 3 at a time, I could hear heavy footfalls behind me. The beast was giving chase, its claws clicking against the steps, growing closer with each passing second. I burst out of the stairwell and into the lobby, my lungs burning, legs trembling with exertion and fear. The glass doors leading to the street were just ahead. Freedom. Safety. If I could just reach them. A weight slammed into me from behind, sending me sprawling. I hit the floor hard, sliding across the polished surface. Dazed, I rolled onto my back, looking up into the face of my worst nightmare. The werewolf loomed over me, saliva dripping from its open jaws. Its hot breath washed over me, reeking of blood and decay. This was it. This was how I was going to die. But as the creature reared back, preparing to strike, a car's headlights swept across the lobby. The sudden brightness seemed to startle the werewolf. It hesitated, its massive head swinging towards the source of the light. That moment of distraction was all I needed. I kicked out with all my strength, my foot connecting solidly with the beast's chest. It stumbled back, more surprised than hurt, but it was enough. I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the doors. I burst out onto the street, the cool night air hitting my sweat-soaked skin. Where could I go? Who would believe me? As I stood there, paralyzed by indecision, I heard a familiar voice. Jack? Oh my God, Jack. It was Sarah, getting out of her car, her eyes wide with shock. I came to check on you when the power went out. What happened? You're bleeding. I opened my mouth to explain, to warn her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I grabbed her arm, pulling her towards the car. We have to go, I managed to croak out. Now. Please, Sarah, drive, just drive. As we peeled away from the curb, I risked a glance back at my apartment building. For a split second, I thought I saw a shape in the shadows, watching us leave. But then we turned a corner, and it was gone. Sarah was asking questions, her voice high with worry, but I couldn't focus on her words. All I could think about was the creature, and the terrifying certainty that this was far from over. It had found me once. It would find me again. And next time, there might be no escape. The sound of shattering glass jolted me from my paralysis. I watched in horror as the massive form of the werewolf burst through my living room window, sending shards flying everywhere. Its yellow eyes locked onto me, filled with predatory hunger. No, 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 I muttered, stumbling backward. My mind raced, searching for an escape route. The front door was blocked by the beast, leaving only one option: the fire escape. I turned and ran for my bedroom, hearing the creature's claws scraping against the hardwood floor as it gave chase. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything but the sound of my own ragged breathing. Reaching the window, I fumbled with the latch, my sweaty hand slipping on the metal. Come on, I hissed, acutely aware of the approaching danger. Just as I felt the werewolf's hot breath on my neck, the window flew open. I dove through, landing hard on the metal grating of the fire escape. Pain shot through my palms and knees, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I scrambled down the stairs, the entire structure shaking as the monster followed. Its growls echoed in the night air, spurring me to move faster. I didn't dare look back, focusing solely on my descent. Reaching the bottom, I leaped the last few feet to the ground, stumbling as I landed. The impact sent shockwaves through my legs, but I pushed through the pain and ran. The streets were eerily empty, the power outage leaving everything in darkness save for the pale moonlight. My bare feet slapped against the cold pavement as I sprinted down the middle of the road, desperately searching for help, for shelter, for anything. "Help!" I screamed, my voice hoarse with terror. "Somebody, please help me!" But no lights came on in the houses I passed. No doors opened. The town slept on, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding in its streets. Behind me, I heard the heavy thud of the werewolf landing on the pavement. Its claws clicked against the asphalt as it gave chase, the sound growing closer with each passing second. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, legs trembling with exertion. But I knew I couldn't outrun it forever. I needed to hide, to find somewhere it couldn't follow. Up ahead, I spotted a narrow alley between two buildings. Without hesitation, I veered towards it, praying it would offer some sanctuary. The alley was dark and cluttered with trash cans and discarded boxes. I weaved through the obstacles, my eyes darting around for a hiding spot. At the far end, I saw a large dumpster. It was my only chance. I dove behind it, pressing myself into the small space between the metal container and the brick wall. The rough surface scraped against my back as I tried to make myself as small as possible. For a moment, all I could hear was my own labored breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart. Had I lost it? Was I safe? Then I heard it, the soft padding of paws at the alley's entrance. I clapped a hand over my mouth, trying to stifle my breathing. Tears streamed down my face as I silently prayed for the creature to pass by. But luck wasn't on my side. A low growl echoed off the alley walls, and I saw the gleam of yellow eyes reflecting the moonlight. It had found me. I watched in terror as the massive shape of the werewolf blocked the alley's entrance. Its head swung from side to side, nostrils flaring as it scented the air. I knew it was only a matter of time before it pinpointed my location. My mind raced, searching for options. I could try to make a break for it, but I knew I'd never outrun the beast in this confined space. Fighting was out of the question. I had no weapons, and even if I did, what could hurt a werewolf? As the creature took a step into the alley, a crazy idea formed in my panic-stricken mind. It was risky, probably suicidal, but it was all I had. I reached out, my hand closing around an empty glass bottle lying among the trash. Taking a deep breath, I hurled it as hard as I could past the werewolf, towards the street beyond. The bottle shattered against the pavement with a loud crash. The werewolf's head whipped towards the sound, its ears perked forward. This was my chance. I burst from my hiding spot, sprinting towards the beast. Its yellow eyes widened in surprise as I barreled towards it. At the last second, I dropped to the ground, sliding on the slick pavement between the creature's legs. I felt fur brush against my arms, heard the snap of jaws just inches from my head. Then I was past it, scrambling to my feet and running back out onto the street. I heard the werewolf snarl in frustration, its claws scrabbling against the ground as it turned to pursue me. But now I had a lead, and I intended to use it. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my bare feet barely touching the ground. Every muscle screamed in protest, but fear drove me forward. Up ahead, I saw a familiar building, the old church in the town center. Its heavy wooden doors might offer some protection if I could just reach them in time. I sprinted up the steps, my hand closing around the iron handle. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought it might be locked. But then the door swung open, and I tumbled inside. Slamming it shut behind me, I fumbled with the ancient bolt, sliding it into place just as something heavy crashed against the other side. The impact shook the entire door, but the bolt held. I staggered backward, watching in horror as the door shuddered under repeated assaults. How long would it hold? Minutes? Seconds? My eyes darted around the dimly lit interior of the church, searching for anything I could use as a weapon or barricade. The werewolf's growls and snarls filled the air, punctuated by the splintering of wood as its claws tore at the door. As I backed further into the church, my foot caught on something. I looked down to see a heavy brass candlestick lying on the floor. I snatched it up, its weight reassuring in my hands. The door gave another ominous crack. I knew it wouldn't hold much longer. Gripping the candlestick tightly, I steeled myself for what was to come. "Come on," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sounds of the beast's assault. "Come on, you bastard. Let's end this." With a final, thunderous crash, the door burst open. The werewolf's massive form filled the doorway, its yellow eyes gleaming with triumph and hunger. As it stalked towards me, saliva dripping from its jaws, I raised the candlestick. It wasn't much of a weapon against a creature of nightmare, but it was all I had. The werewolf tensed, preparing to lunge. I tightened my grip, knowing that the next few moments would determine whether I lived or died. And as the beast sprang forward, I silently prayed that someone, anyone, would hear the coming struggle and come to my aid. But deep down, I knew the terrible truth. In this battle against a monster, I was completely and utterly alone. The old church, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. The werewolf's massive form filled the doorway, its yellow eyes fixed on me with predatory intensity. As it took a step forward, a low growl rumbled from its chest, so deep and powerful that I felt it vibrate through my entire body. My hands tightened around the brass candlestick, my only pathetic defense against this nightmare made flesh. I tried to steady my breathing, to focus, but terror clouded my thoughts. The beast's hot, fetid breath washed over me as it drew closer, and I could see strings of saliva hanging from its dagger-like teeth. "Stay back," I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. The creature's ear twitched at the sound, but it showed no sign of understanding or mercy. This was no misunderstood beast from a fairy tale. This was a predator, and I was its prey. With shocking speed, the werewolf lunged forward. I swung the candlestick wildly, more in panic than with any real strategy. By some miracle, the heavy brass connected with the side of the beast's head. The impact sent shockwaves up my arms, nearly causing me to drop my makeshift weapon. The werewolf snarled in pain and anger, shaking its massive head. I had hurt it, but I'd also enraged it. Before I could react, it swiped at me with one enormous paw. I tried to dodge, but I was too slow. Razor-sharp claws sliced through the air mere inches from my face. I felt the rush of displaced air and stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen hymnal. As I crashed to the floor, the candlestick flew from my grasp, clattering away into the shadows. I scrambled backward on all fours, my eyes never leaving the advancing monster. My back hit something solid, the altar. I was cornered. The werewolf stalked forward, clearly savoring its victory. Its muscles rippled beneath matted fur as it prepared to pounce. Time seemed to slow down. I saw every detail with horrifying clarity. The gleam of moonlight on its claws, the flecks of foam at the corners of its mouth, the hungry gleam in its inhuman eyes. Then it leaped. I threw my arms up in a futile attempt to protect myself. feeling the creature's full weight crash down upon me. The impact drove the air from my lungs. Claws raked across my raised arms, tearing through skin and muscle. The pain was immediate and intense, but the rush of adrenaline kept me fighting. I thrashed wildly, trying to throw the beast off, but it was like trying to move a mountain. Its hot breath washed over my face as jaws snapped inches from my throat. I turned my head away, squeezing my eyes shut, certain that this was the end. In that moment, a searing pain exploded across my back. The werewolf's claws had found their mark, carving deep furrows through flesh and muscle. I screamed in agony, the sound echoing off the church's vaulted ceiling. "Help!" I cried out, knowing it was useless but unable to stop myself. "Somebody please help me!" The werewolf's jaws closed around my shoulder, teeth sinking deep. I felt bones grinding, tendons tearing. The pain was beyond anything I'd ever experienced. Blackness started to creep in at the edges of my vision. I was going to die here, alone and afraid, torn apart by a monster no one believed existed. Then, like an answer to an unspoken prayer, a shrill sound cut through the night, a car alarm, piercing and insistent. The werewolf's head snapped up, its ears swiveling towards the noise. For a split second, its grip on me loosened. It was all the opening I needed. Summoning strength I didn't know I possessed, I drove my knee up into the creature's belly. It wasn't enough to hurt it, but the sudden impact startled it. As it reared back, I rolled to the side, ignoring the screaming pain from my wounds. I staggered to my feet, swaying as waves of dizziness washed over me. Blood soaked my torn shirt, dripping onto the church floor. But I was alive, and I had a chance. The werewolf recovered quickly, turning back towards me with a snarl. But now there was distance between us, and the car alarm continued to blare, clearly agitating the beast. Its head swung back and forth between me and the direction of the noise, as if unsure which to focus on. I didn't waste the opportunity. I lurched towards the side door of the church, praying it wasn't locked. Behind me, I heard the scrape of claws on stone as the werewolf gave chase. My hand closed around the door handle. For one heart-stopping moment, it refused to turn. Then, with a groan of protesting hinges, the door swung open. I stumbled out into the cool night air, gasping in great lungfuls as if I'd been drowning. The car alarm was louder out here, coming from somewhere down the street. I could see flickers of motion as lights came on in nearby houses, people finally stirring to investigate the noise. I wanted to cry out for help, but I knew there wasn't time. The werewolf would be on me in seconds. Instead, I forced my battered body into motion, half running, half stumbling away from the church. Behind me, I heard the beast crash through the door, wood splintering under its assault. Its enraged howl cut through the night, sending shivers down my spine. But it was hesitating, caught between the desire to pursue me and the instinct to flee from the growing sounds of human activity. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. Every step sent waves of agony through my body, but fear drove me forward. Blood loss was making me lightheaded, and I knew I couldn't keep going much longer. Up ahead, I saw a familiar sight. Sarah's car, still parked where she'd left it when she came looking for me earlier. Had it really been only an hour ago? It felt like a lifetime. I staggered towards it, fumbling in my pocket for the spare key she'd given me years ago. My blood-slicked fingers struggled with the lock, precious seconds ticking by. Finally, the door opened. I practically fell into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me. My trembling hands found the ignition and the engine roared to life. As I peeled away from the curb, I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw a massive shape at the edge of the trees, yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness. Then I turned a corner, and it was gone. I drove aimlessly, putting as much distance between myself and the church as possible. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the full extent of my injuries was becoming apparent. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through my body. I knew I needed help, but who would believe me? How could I explain these injuries without sounding completely insane? As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I realized I had a decision to make. I could go to the hospital and try to explain what had happened, knowing they'd likely think I was crazy or on drugs. Or I could try to tend to my wounds myself, keeping the truth of what had happened hidden. As I pulled over to the side of the road, my vision blurring from pain and blood loss, I knew one thing for certain. This night of terror might be over, but my ordeal was far from finished. The werewolf was still out there, and it would be back. And next time, I might not be lucky enough to escape. The steering wheel was slick with my blood as I navigated Sarah's car through the empty pre-dawn streets. Every movement sent waves of agony through my body, reminding me of how close I'd come to death. The werewolf's attack had left me battered and bleeding, but somehow still alive. As I approached the town center, my vision began to blur. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the full extent of my injuries was becoming apparent. I knew I couldn't keep driving like this. I was as much a danger to others as I was to myself. With trembling hands, I pulled over to the curb and cut the engine. For a moment, I just sat there listening to my own ragged breathing. Then, slowly, painfully, I opened the door and staggered out onto the sidewalk. The cool morning air hit me like a slap to the face, bringing a moment of clarity. I looked down at myself and winced. My shirt was in tatters, soaked through with blood. Deep gashes crisscrossed my chest and arms, and I could feel the burning ache of the wounds on my back. "Help," I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need help." But the streets were empty, the houses dark. It was that strange, liminal hour between night and day when the world seems to hold its breath. I stumbled forward, one hand pressed against the worst of my wounds, the other trailing along the wall of a building for support. Each step was an effort, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. That's when I heard it, a long, mournful howl that cut through the quiet of the early morning. My blood ran cold. It couldn't be. Not again. Not so soon, but there was no mistaking that sound. The werewolf was coming. Panic gave me strength I didn't know I still possessed. I pushed myself away from the wall and began to run, if you could call my stumbling gait running. My bare feet slapped against the cold pavement as I made my way towards the center of town. "Help!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the buildings. "Someone, please, help me!" I pounded on doors as I passed, not caring which house it was or who lived there. But no lights came on, no doors opened. The town slept on, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding in its streets. Another howl rang out, closer this time. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. At the far end of the street, a massive shape emerged from the shadows. The church stood silent, its ancient stones a silent sentinel against the encroaching darkness. I huddled in a pew near the altar, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give away my position. The moonlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting eerie, distorted shadows across the worn stone floor. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe I had found safety, that the nightmare prowling outside would pass me by, leaving me to nurse my wounds and try to make sense of the insanity that had become my reality. But deep down, I knew better. I had seen the glint of murderous intelligence in those inhuman eyes. This wasn't some mindless beast acting on instinct. It was hunting me. The first impact against the heavy wooden doors made me flinch violently. The sudden noise shattered the oppressive silence, echoing through the empty church like a gunshot. I bit back a cry, clamping my hand over my mouth to stifle any sound. Thud. Another blow, stronger this time. I could hear the wood groan in protest. Thud, crack. My eyes widened in horror as I saw splinters explode inward from the door. Whatever was out there, it was inhumanly strong, and it wanted in. "Oh God," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "Please help me." But if there was a God listening, he remained silent as the assault on the church doors continued. Each impact sent tremors through the floor, vibrating up through the pews. I found myself gripping the worn wood so tightly my knuckles turned white. Crash. A particularly vicious blow sent one of the door's metal hinges flying across the nave. It clattered against the stone floor, the sound seeming to echo forever in the cavernous space. I couldn't just sit here and wait for death. Forcing my trembling legs to move, I stumbled towards the altar. My eyes darted frantically around the church interior, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. Come on, I muttered, desperation clawing at my throat. There has to be something. My gaze fell on a heavy brass candlestick near the altar. It wasn't much, but it was solid and had some weight to it. I snatched it up, testing its heft. It would have to do. Just as my fingers closed around the cold metal, an almighty crash reverberated through the church. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The doors had given way. Moonlight spilled into the nave, backlighting a nightmarish silhouette that filled the entire doorway. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with a bulk that seemed to defy nature. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out more details. The coarse fur, the elongated snout, the ears that twitched and swiveled, searching for any sound. But it was the eyes that held me transfixed. Yellow, gleaming with an alien intelligence that sent ice through my veins. This was no animal. This was something else entirely. The werewolf, for what else could I call this monstrosity, took a step into the church. Its claws clicked against the stone floor, the sound obscenely loud in the hushed interior. I found myself backing away, the candlestick held out before me like a talisman. "Stay back," I said, my voice cracking. "Just stay back." A low growl rumbled from the creature's chest, a sound that spoke of hunger and violence barely held in check. It took another step forward and then another. I could see saliva glistening on its fangs. Time seemed to slow. I saw the bunching of powerful muscles beneath that dark fur. I saw the way its eyes narrowed, focusing on me with predatory intensity. And I knew with a certainty that went beyond fear that it was about to lunge. I didn't think. I didn't plan. Pure survival instinct took over. As the werewolf sprang towards me, I swung the candlestick with every ounce of strength I possessed. There was a sickening thud as the brass connected with the side of its head. The impact sent shockwaves up my arms, nearly wrenching the makeshift weapon from my grasp. The creature let out a roar of pain and fury that shook dust from the rafters. It stumbled, momentarily stunned by the blow. But I knew it wouldn't last long. I bolted for the sacristy, praying there would be another way out. Behind me, I could hear the scraping of claws on stone as the monster regained its footing. The snarl that followed chilled me to my very core. The sacristy door was locked. Of course it was. I slammed my shoulder against it once, twice, desperation lending me strength I didn't know I possessed. On the third impact, the ancient wood gave way with a splintering crack. I tumbled into the small room, surrounded by vestments and liturgical items. My eyes darted around frantically, searching for an escape route. There, a small window, high up on the wall. It would be a tight squeeze, but it was my only chance. As I scrambled to climb the shelves, using them as a makeshift ladder, I heard the werewolf enter the sacristy. The growl it let out was pure malevolence. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. Blood matted the fur on one side of its head where I'd struck it. But instead of slowing it down, the injury seemed to have driven it into a frenzy. Yellowed fangs were bared in a snarl of rage, and those eyes. God, those eyes burned with an almost human hatred. I redoubled my efforts to reach the window, ignoring the pain as splinters dug into my palms. The creature lunged just as my fingers closed on the window latch. I felt the whoosh of air as razor-sharp claws barely missed my ankle. With a cry of mingled terror and effort, I wrenched the window open and hurled myself through the opening. It was a tighter fit than I'd realized, and for one heart-stopping moment, I thought I was stuck. Then I popped free, tumbling to the ground outside in an ungraceful heap. I didn't waste a second. Scrambling to my feet, I ran as if all the demons of hell were on my heels. And in a way, perhaps they were. Behind me, I heard the sound of shattering glass and splintering wood. An enraged howl split the night, a sound of frustration and promised violence. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. To look back was to die. So I ran. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. I ran until the church was far behind me, and the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Only then did I allow myself to slow, to gulp in great lungfuls of air, to take stock of my injuries. As the adrenaline began to fade, the pain set in. My body was a canvas of cuts, bruises, and what felt like at least one cracked rib. But I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I was still alive. I stumbled towards the road, knowing I needed to find help to get medical attention. But even as that thought formed, another chilled me to the bone. Who would believe me? What doctor or nurse would accept a story of werewolves and battles in abandoned churches? No, I realized with a sinking feeling. This was my burden to bear alone, at least for now. As I limped towards town, the weight of what had happened began to settle on me. The forest that had once been a place of peace and refuge now loomed dark and forbidding behind me. I knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that I would never set foot in those woods again. The sun was just peeking over the horizon as I reached the outskirts of town. Its warm light should have been comforting, but all I felt was a bone-deep weariness. My ordeal wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But I had survived the night, and for now that would have to be enough. The heavy brass candlestick vibrated in my hands, the impact of the blow reverberating up my arms. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The werewolf's massive form swayed, its yellow eyes unfocused. I'd actually managed to hurt it. But the reprieve was fleeting. A growl, low and menacing, rumbled from deep within the beast's chest. Those inhuman eyes locked onto mine, filled with a murderous rage that chilled me to my very core. I stumbled backward, my grip on the candlestick so tight my knuckles turned white. "Stay back," I rasped, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just stay away from me." The creature's only response was to bare its fangs, saliva dripping from yellowed teeth that looked capable of tearing me apart with ease. It took a step forward, claws clicking against the stone floor of the church. I retreated further, my back pressed against the altar. This was it. I was going to die here, torn to shreds by something that shouldn't even exist. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat, but I choked it back. I couldn't lose it now, not when every second might be my last. Just as the werewolf tensed to spring, a miracle happened. A single ray of sunlight, golden and pure, pierced through one of the stained glass windows. It fell across the beast's fur, and the effect was instantaneous. The creature let out a howl of agony that shook dust from the rafters. It recoiled as if struck, massive paws batting at the patch of light on its flank. I watched in stunned disbelief as wisps of smoke rose from where the sunbeam touched. "Impossible," I breathed, unable to believe what I was seeing. But there was no denying the evidence before my eyes. As more slivers of dawnlight began to filter through the windows, the werewolf's howls grew more frantic. It backed away, seeking the shadows, but the encroaching sunlight left it fewer and fewer places to hide. I found my voice, a surge of hope giving me courage I didn't know I possessed. "That's right, you bastard, get out of here." The beast's eyes met mine one last time, and I swear I saw something there beyond animal rage. Was it fear, intelligence? Whatever it was gone in an instant as another shaft of sunlight fell across its face. With a final, ear-splitting roar, the werewolf turned and bolted for the shattered church doors. Its massive form was silhouetted for a moment against the pre-dawn sky before it vanished into the shadows of the forest. Silence fell, broken only by my ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. I stood there, candlestick still clutched in my trembling hands, for what felt like an eternity. Part of me was certain this was all a trick, that any moment the monster would come crashing back through the doors to finish what it started. But as the minutes ticked by and the church grew brighter with the rising sun, the reality of my survival began to sink in. My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor, my back against the altar. The candlestick clattered to the ground beside me. "I'm alive," I whispered, barely able to believe it. Holy shit, I'm actually alive. As the adrenaline began to fade, the pain set in. Every inch of my body ached. I could feel warm wetness on my side where the creature's claws had caught me earlier, and my shoulder throbbed where I'd rammed the sacristy door. But I was alive, and that was more than I dared hope for just moments ago. I don't know how long I sat there, basking in the simple fact of my continued existence. But eventually, the practical part of my brain kicked in. I needed help. My injuries, while not immediately life-threatening, were serious enough to require medical attention. With a groan of pain, I pulled myself to my feet. The world swam for a moment, and I had to grip the altar to keep from falling. Once the dizziness passed, I made my way slowly towards the church entrance. I paused at the threshold, looking out at the forest beyond. In the growing light of day, it seemed almost peaceful. But I knew better now. I knew what horrors lurked in those shadowy depths. Never again, I muttered, turning my back on the woods. I'm never setting foot in there again. The walk into town was a blur of pain and exhaustion. By the time I stumbled into the emergency room, I was barely on my feet. The nurse at the desk took one look at me and sprang into action. Sir, can you hear me? What happened to you?" I opened my mouth to explain, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I possibly make them understand? Who would believe a story of werewolves and battles in abandoned churches? I was attacked, I finally managed. In the woods. Some kind of animal. The nurse's eyes widened. An animal did this to you? What kind of animal? I hesitated. I'm not sure. It was big and fast. I didn't get a good look at it. It wasn't entirely a lie, but the guilt of the omission still gnawed at me. As they rushed me into an examination room, I could hear the nurse speaking urgently into a phone, mentioning animal control and the Forest Service. But I knew they wouldn't find anything. No tracks, no fur, no evidence of the nightmare I'd endured. The werewolf had vanished into the shadows, leaving only my battered body and fractured psyche as proof of its existence. As the doctor began examining my wounds, I closed my eyes, exhaustion finally overtaking me. But even as consciousness slipped away, one thought echoed in my mind. This wasn't over. Somehow I knew that the horrors of the past night were just the beginning. The beast was still out there, waiting in the dark. And as the comforting beep of hospital machinery lulled me into an uneasy sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that our paths would cross again. Next time I might not be so lucky. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as I limped towards the police station. Each step sent shockwaves of pain through my battered body, but I pressed on. I had to tell someone, had to make them understand the danger lurking in our quiet town. As I pushed open the station door, the cool air-conditioned interior was a stark contrast to the oppressive heat outside. The desk sergeant looked up, his eyes widening as he took in my disheveled appearance. "Jesus Christ, son, what happened to you?" he exclaimed, rushing around the desk to help me to a chair. I sank into the seat gratefully, wincing as my injuries protested the movement. I need to report an attack," I managed, my voice hoarse. The sergeant's face grew serious. "Of course. Let me get Detective Ramirez. She'll want to hear this." As we waited for the detective, the sergeant offered me water, which I gulped down greedily. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to explain what had happened without sounding completely insane. Detective Ramirez arrived quickly, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of my appearance. "I'm Detective Ramirez. Can you tell me what happened?" I took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in my ribs. "I was attacked, in the old church near the forest." "Attacked by whom?" Ramirez asked, her pen poised over a notepad. This was it, the moment of truth. It was a werewolf," I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as the detective and the sergeant exchanged a look I couldn't quite decipher. "A werewolf," Ramirez repeated, her tone carefully neutral. "Can you elaborate on that?" So I did. I told them everything. The chase through the forest, seeking refuge in the church, the beast's relentless assault. As I spoke, I could see the doubt creeping into their expressions. "And you're certain it wasn't just a large wolf or bear?" the sergeant asked, his brow furrowed. I shook my head vehemently. "No, you don't understand. This thing was massive, walking on two legs. It was something else entirely." Detective Ramirez's pen had stopped moving. She closed her notepad with a soft snap. "Mr. Your last name. I think we need to get you to a hospital. You've clearly been through a traumatic experience, and those injuries need attention." "But what about the werewolf?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "It's still out there." "We'll look into it," Ramirez assured me, but I could hear the lack of conviction in her voice. "Right now, let's focus on getting you medical attention." The ride to the hospital was a blur. As the adrenaline wore off, the full extent of my injuries made themselves known. By the time we arrived at the emergency room, I was barely conscious. I drifted in and out of awareness as doctors and nurses swarmed around me. Snippets of conversation reached my ears. Multiple lacerations, possible concussion. What could have done this? He claims it was a werewolf. Poor kid. Must have been terrified out of his mind. I wanted to scream to make them understand that it wasn't a delusion or a hallucination, but exhaustion and pain pulled me under and darkness claimed me. When I next opened my eyes, it was to the sight of my parents' worried faces. My mother's eyes were red-rimmed, and my father looked like he'd aged a decade overnight. "Oh, sweetheart," Mom whispered, gently squeezing my hand. We were so worried. "What happened, son?" Dad asked, his voice gruff with concern. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words died in my throat as I saw Detective Ramirez enter the room, followed by a doctor. "Mr. and Mrs. Your last name," the doctor began, his tone professional yet sympathetic. "Your son has suffered multiple injuries consistent with a wild animal attack. We've treated the lacerations and are monitoring him for signs of infection. He also has a mild concussion, which explains some of his, confusion about the events." I felt a surge of anger. "I'm not confused," I insisted, trying to sit up. Pain lanced through my side, forcing me back down. "I know what I saw." My parents exchanged a worried glance. "Honey," Mom said softly, "you've been through a terrible ordeal. It's okay if things are a bit jumbled right now." "No, you don't understand," I pleaded, looking from face to face, desperate for someone to believe me. "It wasn't just an animal, it was a werewolf," Detective Ramirez finished, her tone gentle but firm. "Yes, you mentioned that at the station. Look, your first name? Trauma can do strange things to our perceptions. What matters now is that you're safe and getting the care you need." I fell silent, the fight draining out of me. It was clear that no one was going to believe the truth. To them, I was just a scared kid who'd had a run-in with a wild animal and let his imagination run wild. The next few hours passed in a haze of tests, questions, and worried looks. When the doctor finally announced I could be discharged, it was almost a relief. I couldn't bear another moment of pitying glances and carefully worded questions about my experience. As my dad helped me into the car, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. Cuts, bruises, and bandages told the story of my ordeal. But they didn't tell the whole truth. They couldn't convey the terror of those yellow eyes, the sound of claws on stone, the horrifying intelligence behind the beast's gaze. I slumped in the back seat, a wave of isolation washing over me. The truth of that night would be my burden to bear alone. No one would ever believe what really happened in those dark woods and that abandoned church. As we drove away from the hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The werewolf was still out there, hidden in the shadows of the forest, and I was the only one who knew the danger that lurked on the outskirts of our town. The weight of that knowledge settled heavily on my shoulders as we headed home. The drive up to Blackwood Mountain had been long and tiring, but as I pulled my battered Subaru into the deserted campground, a sense of unease replaced my fatigue. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy of pine trees, casting dappled shadows across the empty parking area. I'd expected to see other campers, maybe a few RVs or tents set up in the nearby clearings. Instead, I was greeted by an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow even the sound of my car's engine as it sputtered to a stop. I sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, as I scanned the area. The campground looked well maintained, with neatly trimmed grass and freshly painted picnic tables, but there was something off about it. It felt abandoned, as if nature was already in the process of reclaiming it. Shaking off the growing sense of discomfort, I grabbed my backpack and stepped out of the car. The air was crisp and carried the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Under different circumstances, it might have been invigorating, but here, in this unnaturally quiet forest, it felt oppressive, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I made my way to the ranger station, a small log cabin at the edge of the campground. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Anyone here?" After a moment, a grizzled man in a park ranger uniform emerged from a back room. His eyes narrowed as he took me in, a mix of surprise and something else. Was it concern? Flickering across his weathered face. "Didn't expect to see anyone up here," he said gruffly. "Campground's been pretty quiet lately." I forced a smile, trying to shake off my growing unease. "Just looking to get away for a few days. Do I need to sign in or anything?" The ranger hesitated, his gaze drifting to the window and the darkening forest beyond. "Listen, son," he said, his voice low. "We've had some issues lately. Animal attacks. Nothing confirmed, but there's been reports of livestock getting torn up in the valley. Might want to consider finding another spot to camp." A chill ran down my spine at his words. "Animal attacks? What kind of animal?" He shrugged, but the tension in his shoulders belied his casual tone. "Could be a bear, maybe a mountain lion. Game wardens are looking into it. But between you and me, something doesn't feel right about it. The way those animals were killed, it ain't natural." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "Thanks for the warning, but I've come a long way. I'll be careful. Keep my food sealed up tight." The ranger looked like he wanted to say more, but just nodded instead. "Your call. Just keep your wits about you, all right? And if you hear anything strange in the night, anything at all, you hightail it out of here. Understood?" I nodded, the weight of his warning settling heavily on my shoulders as I left the station. Part of me wanted to heed his advice and leave, but I'd driven for hours to get here, and the thought of turning back now seemed ridiculous. It was probably just a bear, I told myself. Nothing I couldn't handle with some common sense and precautions. As I set up my tent in a small clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sent my heart racing. The sun was setting rapidly, the shadows of the towering pines stretching like grasping fingers across my campsite. I busied myself with setting up camp, hoping the familiar routine would calm my nerves. But as I hammered in the last tent stake, a loud crack echoed through the clearing. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, eyes frantically scanning the tree line. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Is someone there?" Only silence answered me, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I could have sworn I saw something move just beyond the edge of the clearing, a dark shape melting into the shadows. But when I blinked, it was gone. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, running a hand through my hair. "It's just your imagination." As night fell, I built a small fire, its warm glow providing little comfort against the encroaching darkness. The full moon rose, impossibly large and bright, casting an eerie silvery light across the campsite. Long shadows danced at the edge of my vision, seeming to twist and writhe in ways that shadows shouldn't. I tried to distract myself by reading, but found myself rereading the same paragraph over and over, unable to focus. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified. The rustle of leaves, the creak of branches, the scurrying of small animals. Or at least I hoped they were small animals. Finally, exhaustion began to overtake my anxiety. I doused the fire and retreated to my tent, zipping myself securely inside as if the thin nylon could protect me from whatever might be lurking in the darkness. As I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the dome of my tent, I tried to rationalize my fears. I'd been camping dozens of times before. This was no different. The ranger's warning had just put me on edge, that's all. There was nothing out there that hadn't been there on any other camping trip. But as I finally began to drift off to sleep, a sound cut through the night that sent ice through my veins. A howl, long and mournful, echoed through the mountains. It wasn't the yip of a coyote, or even the haunting call of a wolf. This was something different, something primal and terrifying that spoke to a deep, instinctual part of my brain. And it was close. Far too close. I lay there, every muscle tensed, barely daring to breathe as I strained my ears. The howl faded, leaving behind a silence even more oppressive than before. As the minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness, I tried to convince myself that it had been my imagination, a trick of the wind through the mountains. But deep down, I knew. Something was out there in the darkness, something that didn't belong. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when the sound jolted me awake. My eyes snapped open in the darkness of my tent, heart instantly racing. It wasn't the snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves. This was something heavy, something big, moving with purpose just outside the thin fabric walls. For a moment I lay frozen, ears straining. The sound came again, a soft thud like a massive paw hitting the ground, followed by the unmistakable crunch of pine needles. Whatever it was circling my tent. I held my breath, praying that my thundering heartbeat wouldn't give me away. The footsteps paused, and for a split second, I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, it was moving on. Then I saw it. A massive silhouette lumbered past the side of my tent, backlit by the full moon that hung low and bloated in the sky. The shape was all wrong for a bear, too tall, too human-like in its proportions. But the head was unmistakably canine, with pointed ears and what looked like a long, powerful muzzle. My breath caught in my throat, a strangled gasp that I quickly stifled with my hand. The silhouette paused, and I swear I saw those pointed ears swivel in my direction. Time seemed to stretch as I lay there barely daring to breathe, watching that impossible shape. It stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, and I found myself silently pleading, "Please move on. Please, please just go away." As if hearing my thoughts, the creature began to move again, its massive form melting into the shadows beyond my tent. The sound of its footsteps faded, but the pounding of my heart only grew louder. I needed to see. I needed to know if what I'd witnessed was real or if the ranger's warnings and my own overactive imagination had conjured up some nightmarish apparition. With shaking hands, I fumbled for my flashlight. It slipped through my sweat-slicked fingers once, twice, before I managed to grip it. The click of the switch sounded deafening in the stillness of the night. A beam of light cut through the darkness, and I slowly, carefully unzipped the tent flap. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to hide, but I had to know. I poked my head out, sweeping the flashlight beam across the campsite. Nothing. Just empty forest. The trees casting long, reaching shadows in the moonlight. Emboldened by the apparent emptiness, I stepped out of the tent, my bare feet sinking into the cool earth. The beam of my flashlight danced across tree trunks and undergrowth, revealing nothing but the usual nighttime forest. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting the sound of my voice breaking the silence. "Is anyone there?" Only the whisper of wind through the pines answered me. I took a few hesitant steps forward, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw them. A set of tracks leading away from my tent. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Massive paw prints, but with an oddly human-like shape to them. 5 distinct toe marks splayed out at the front, ending in what could only be claw impressions. I crouched down, my hand hovering over one of the prints. It was easily twice the size of my own hand. What the hell made these? I whispered to myself. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. I jerked upright, the beam of light dancing wildly as I spun around. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. Silence. But I could feel it, eyes watching me from the shadows. The weight of that unseen gaze prickled along my skin, raising goosebumps despite the mild night air. "This isn't funny," I shouted, anger momentarily overriding my fear. "If this is some kind of joke, it's not." A low, rumbling growl cut through the night, so deep I felt it vibrate in my chest. It was close, far too close, and it was unmistakably a warning. I backpedaled towards my tent, the flashlight beam jerking erratically across the tree line. Just for a moment, I caught a glimpse of something. A flash of yellow eyes reflecting in the light, gone so quickly I couldn't be sure I'd really seen it. I all but dove back into my tent, zipping it up with frantic, fumbling fingers, as if that thin barrier of nylon could protect me from whatever was out there. "It's just a bear," I muttered to myself, trying to slow my ragged breathing. "The ranger warned you about bears. That's all it is. Just a curious bear." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. Bears didn't leave tracks like that. Bears didn't move with that eerie, almost human gait. And bears certainly didn't have eyes that glowed with what I could have sworn was intelligence and hunger. I huddled in my sleeping bag, the flashlight clutched to my chest like a child's security blanket. Sleep was out of the question now. Every sound from the forest became magnified, took on new and terrifying meaning. The rustle of leaves became the stealthy movements of a predator. The hoot of an owl became a mocking laugh. And always, always I felt those eyes on me, watching, waiting. As the night wore on, my mind raced through possibilities, each more outlandish than the last. Could it be some undiscovered species? A genetic experiment gone wrong? Or something else? Something that shouldn't exist outside of campfire stories and old legends? I found myself longing for the dawn, for the safety that daylight would bring. But a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, the coming of day wouldn't make a difference, that whatever was out there in the darkness wasn't bound by the normal rules of nature. As the first faint hints of pre-dawn light began to filter through the trees, I made a decision. As soon as it was fully light, I was getting out of here. Camping trip be damned. I'd seen and heard enough to know that staying would be suicide. But even as I began to formulate my escape plan, a part of me wondered, would it let me leave? Or had I stumbled into something that wouldn't end until it caught up with me no matter how far I ran? With that chilling thought, I waited for the dawn, every sense straining for any sign of the creature's return. The long night was finally ending, but I had a sinking feeling that my ordeal was just beginning. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the dense canopy, I cautiously unzipped my tent, my eyes darting around the campsite. The forest seemed deceptively peaceful in the soft morning light, but the memory of last night's terror still coiled in my gut, like a cold, heavy stone. I stepped out, my boots crunching on the pine needles. That's when I saw it. Deep, jagged claw marks gouged into the trunk of a nearby pine tree. My breath caught in my throat as I approached, my hand reaching out to trace the grooves. They were fresh, the exposed wood still oozing sap. "Jesus," I whispered, my fingers trembling as they followed the marks. They started about 7 feet up the trunk and raked downward, each groove easily as wide as my thumb. Whatever had made these was big, too big. I stumbled back, my eyes now frantically scanning the ground. That's when I noticed them, paw prints, large canine-like prints that circled my campsite in a deliberate pattern. I crouched down, my heart pounding as I examined them more closely. They were massive, easily twice the size of any wolf print I'd ever seen. "This can't be real," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. This has to be some kind of joke. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The depth of the prints, the way the earth was compressed, these were made by something heavy, something real. I rushed back to my tent, grabbing my cell phone. I had to call for help, to report this to someone. Anyone. But as I looked at the screen, my heart sank. No signal. Come on, I pleaded, holding the phone up and walking around the campsite. But it was useless. I was too deep in the mountains, too far from any cell towers. I stood there, phone still held aloft, as the reality of my situation sank in. I was alone out here, alone with whatever had made those marks. The forest, which had seemed so inviting just yesterday, now felt like it was closing in on me. The trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I needed to get out of here. Now. With shaking hands, I began to break down my camp, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The paw prints seemed to mock me, a constant reminder that I was being hunted. As I stuffed the last of my gear into my backpack, a sound made me freeze. A low, guttural growl, so deep I felt it more than heard it. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, my eyes wide, searching for the source. But the forest remained stubbornly empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Is someone there?" Only the whisper of wind through the pines answered me. But I could feel it, eyes watching me from the shadows. The weight of that unseen gaze prickled along my skin, raising goosebumps despite the warming morning air. I shouldered my pack, abandoning any pretense of properly breaking down camp. I just needed to get to my car, to get out of these God-forsaken woods. The hike back to the parking area wasn't long, maybe a mile at most. But with each step, the forest seemed to press in closer. Branches reached out, snagging my clothes. Roots seemed to rise up from the earth, trying to trip me. And always that feeling of being watched. Halfway back to my car, I paused to catch my breath, leaning against a tree. That's when I saw it. Another set of those massive paw prints, fresh in the soft earth of the trail. They hadn't been there yesterday when I hiked in. It was following me. Panic surged through me and I broke into a run. Branches whipped at my face as I tore down the trail, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear something moving in the underbrush parallel to the trail, keeping pace with me effortlessly. Just as I thought my lungs would burst, the trees thinned, and I burst into the parking area. My car sat there, a beautiful sight of normality and safety. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the lock. As I yanked open the door, a howl echoed through the forest, long, mournful, and terrifyingly close. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door and locking it in one frantic motion. The key slid into the ignition, and I silently prayed to whatever might be listening as I turned it. The engine roared to life, and I nearly cried with relief. I threw the car into reverse, tires spitting gravel as I backed out of the space. As I shifted into drive, my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. For just a split second I saw something. A shape at the edge of the forest, massive and hunched, and eyes, yellow eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural light. I floored the accelerator, the tires squealing as I fishtailed onto the access road. My hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel as I sped down the mountain, taking the curves far too fast. It wasn't until I hit the main highway, the forest receding in my rearview mirror, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. But even as the miles ticked by, putting distance between me and those woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Whatever I had encountered up there, whatever had hunted me, I had a sinking feeling it wasn't done with me yet. And as I drove on, heading for the safety of civilization, a chill ran down my spine. Because for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a dark shape loping along the tree line, keeping pace with my car, watching, waiting. I'd been driving for hours, the events at the campsite replaying in my mind like a nightmare on loop. As the sun began to set, I realized I'd missed my turn somewhere along the winding mountain roads. My gas gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty, and my cell phone still showed no signal. With a sinking feeling, I knew I had to pull over and try to get my bearings. I eased the car onto a small turnout overlooking a steep, forested ravine. The view would have been breathtaking under different circumstances, but now the endless sea of pines only filled me with dread. I stepped out of the car, stretching my cramped muscles and trying to quell the gnawing fear in my gut. That's when I heard it. A low, menacing growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. My blood turned to ice, and I froze mid-stretch, hardly daring to breathe. It couldn't be. Not here, not now. I was miles away from the campsite. Slowly, I turned towards the sound. At first, I saw nothing but shadows among the trees. Then a pair of yellow eyes blinked into existence, reflecting the fading sunlight like twin flames in the gathering darkness. "No," I whispered, my voice a strangled rasp. "This isn't possible." The growl came again, louder this time, and I caught a glimpse of movement, something massive shifting in the underbrush. Without conscious thought, my body made a decision my mind was too terrified to process. I ran. I plunged into the forest, branches whipping my face as I tore through the underbrush. I had no plan, no direction, just a primal need to put distance between myself and the monster behind me. Heavy footfalls pounded the earth, gaining ground with each thunderous step. The creature moved with impossible speed, crashing through obstacles that slowed me down. Branches tore at my clothes. Roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't dare slow down. "Help!" I screamed, knowing it was futile but unable to stop myself. "Somebody help me!" My only answer was a bone-chilling howl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was close. Too close. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of gleaming fangs and those terrible yellow eyes now blazing with predatory focus. The sight sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through my system. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning with each ragged breath. Branches scratched my face, drawing blood, but I barely felt it. Every fiber of my being was focused on one thing: survival. I burst through a thicket into a small clearing, momentarily disoriented by the open space. That's when I heard a voice. Human, blessedly human, coming from somewhere to my left. "Hey, are you okay?" I turned towards the sound, hope flaring in my chest. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, a fishing rod in his hand and a look of concern on his face. "Run!" I screamed, waving my arms frantically. "For God's sake, run!" The man's expression shifted from concern to confusion, then to outright fear as he looked past me. His eyes widened, and the fishing rod clattered to the ground as he turned and bolted into the trees. I didn't need to look back to know what he'd seen. The growl that ripped through the air behind me was confirmation enough. I sprinted after the fisherman, praying he knew these woods better than I did. "Wait," I called out, struggling to keep him in sight. "Please help me." But the man was driven by the same terror that fueled me, and he quickly outpaced me, disappearing into the gathering darkness. I was alone again, with death snapping at my heels. I veered sharply to the right, hoping to throw off my pursuer. The ground began to slope downward, and I realized I was heading into a ravine. Part of me knew this was dangerous. I could easily break an ankle on the uneven terrain, but the larger part of me recognized that slowing down meant certain death. As I half ran, half slid down the slope, I could hear the creature behind me. It moved with sickening grace, barely slowed by the treacherous footing. I chanced another look back and immediately regretted it. The beast was fully visible now, a nightmarish fusion of wolf and man. Its muscled form rippled as it ran, saliva dripping from jaws that could easily crush my skull. My foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling, tumbling head over heels down the slope. Pain exploded through my body as I hit rocks and branches, but terror kept me moving. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the protests of my battered body. The sound of rushing water reached my ears, and hope flared in my chest. A river. If I could just reach it, maybe I could. My thoughts were cut short as a massive weight slammed into my back, sending me crashing to the ground. Hot breath hit the back of my neck, and I felt the prick of claws digging into my shoulders. This was it. This was how I was going to die. But some last reserve of strength surged through me. With a scream that was equal parts terror and defiance, I twisted, my elbow connecting solidly with the creature's muzzle. It yelped, a oddly canine sound from such a monstrous being, and its grip loosened just enough. I tore free, leaving scraps of my shirt in its claws, and ran with a speed born of absolute desperation. The river was close now. I could see the moonlight glinting off its surface through the trees. My lungs were on fire, every muscle screaming in protest, but I pushed on. Behind me, I heard the creature recover and resume its pursuit. It was toying with me, I realized. It could have caught me at any time. This was a game to it, and I was rapidly running out of moves. As I burst out of the tree line onto the riverbank, I knew I had only seconds to make a decision. The water rushed by, fast and deep, promising either salvation or a watery grave. The sound of snapping branches behind me made the choice for me. With a final desperate prayer, I leaped into the churning rapids, just as a furious howl split the night air. The icy water closed over my head, and the current immediately swept me away. As I fought to keep my head above water, struggling against the pull of the river, one thought pounded through my mind in time with my racing heart. I was still alive. The icy river had carried me far downstream before I managed to drag myself onto the bank, coughing and sputtering. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest as I stumbled to my feet, my waterlogged clothes weighing me down. The moonlight cast eerie shadows through the trees, and every sound made me flinch. I had no idea where I was or how far I'd traveled, but I knew I couldn't stop moving. That thing was still out there, hunting me. I forced my battered body forward, pushing through the underbrush, driven by pure survival instinct. Time lost all meaning as I stumbled through the forest. Minutes or hours could have passed, I couldn't tell. My mind was a fog of terror and exhaustion, every shadow seeming to come alive with yellow eyes and gleaming fangs. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I broke through a line of trees into a small clearing. The sudden open space disoriented me, and my legs finally gave out. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my hands clutching at the damp earth beneath me. Just need to rest for a moment, I panted, trying to calm my racing heart. But even as the words left my lips, I knew it was a mistake. I was exposed here, vulnerable. A twig snapped somewhere behind me and I froze. Slowly, painfully, I turned my head to look back the way I had come. At first, I saw nothing but shadows among the trees. Then a pair of yellow eyes blinked into existence, and my blood ran cold. It had found me. I tried to scramble to my feet, but my exhausted muscles refused to cooperate. I managed to get to my hands and knees, crawling desperately across the clearing. Behind me, I heard the soft thud of heavy paws on earth, drawing closer with each passing second. Hot breath hit the back of my neck, and I knew it was over. I could feel the creature's presence looming over me, ready to strike. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, could feel every bead of sweat rolling down my face. "Please," I whispered, though I knew it was futile. This thing, whatever it was, had no mercy in it, no humanity. Just as I felt the brush of fur against my back, my hand found empty air. I had reached the edge of the clearing without realizing it, and beyond was a steep embankment. Without thinking, driven by pure desperation, I threw myself forward. The world spun around me as I tumbled down the slope. Rocks and branches tore at my skin, but I barely felt the pain. All I knew was that I was moving, putting distance between myself and the monster. I hit the bottom of the embankment with a splash, finding myself in a shallow creek. The shock of the cold water jolted me back to full awareness, and I quickly assessed my situation. The creek was maybe a foot deep, lined with large rocks that created small eddies and currents. A furious howl echoed from above, and I instinctively pressed myself against the creek bed, trying to make myself as small as possible. The water flowed over me, and I prayed it would be enough to mask my scent. I heard the creature moving along the top of the embankment, pacing back and forth. Its frustrated growls sent shivers down my spine, but I didn't dare move. I focused on keeping my breathing shallow, fighting against the urge to gasp for air. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. The beast's movements became more frantic, its howls more enraged. I could picture it in my mind, those terrible yellow eyes scanning the creek bed, searching for any sign of me. Come on, I thought desperately. Give up. Please, just give up. As if in answer to my silent plea, a new sound cut through the night, the distant bark of dogs. The creature's head snapped up, a low growl rumbling from its throat. For a moment, it stood perfectly still as if weighing its options. Then, with a final bone-chilling howl that echoed through the valley, it turned and loped off into the forest. I remained motionless in the creek, hardly daring to believe it was gone. The cold water numbed my body, but I was afraid to so much as twitch a muscle. What if it was a trick? What if it was waiting for me to reveal myself? The barking grew louder, and I heard voices calling out in the distance. Search parties? Had someone reported me missing? Hello? I finally called out, my voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. Is someone there? There was no response, and I realized the voices were still too far away to hear me. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up, water streaming off my body. Every movement sent waves of pain through me, but the adrenaline was wearing off, and I knew I needed to get out of the creek before hypothermia set in. I dragged myself onto the bank, collapsing onto the damp earth. The voices were getting closer now, and I could see flashlight beams dancing through the trees. Over here, I shouted, or tried to. It came out as more of a croak. Please, I'm over here. A beam of light swept over me, and I heard a shout of surprise. We've got someone! Over here! Footsteps crashed through the underbrush, and suddenly I was surrounded by people. Park rangers from the looks of their uniforms. Hands reached out to help me up, voices asking questions I couldn't quite process. Sir, are you all right? What happened to you? I opened my mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could I possibly describe what I'd been through? Who would believe me? As they helped me to my feet, wrapping an emergency blanket around my shoulders, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Just for a split second, I saw a pair of yellow eyes watching from the shadows before they blinked out of existence. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. This wasn't over. Somehow I knew that creature would be back. And next time, I might not be so lucky. The first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon as I stumbled into the small town of Pine Ridge. My clothes were in tatters, caked with mud and leaves, and every step sent waves of pain through my battered body. The few early risers on the street stopped and stared, their eyes wide with shock and curiosity. I must have looked like a wild man, fresh from the depths of some primal nightmare. In a way, that's exactly what I was. An elderly woman watering flowers on her porch took one look at me and hurried inside, the screen door slamming behind her. I couldn't blame her. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a storefront window and barely recognized myself. Wild eyes, matted hair, and scratches covering every visible inch of skin. "Excuse me," I croaked to a man unlocking the door to a small diner. "Where's the sheriff's office?" He pointed wordlessly down the street, his eyes never leaving my face. I nodded my thanks and limped on, each step a monumental effort. The sheriff's office was a small brick building with a single patrol car parked out front. I pushed open the door, the bell above jangling cheerfully, a stark contrast to the horror I'd just escaped. A young deputy looked up from his desk, his coffee mug freezing halfway to his lips as he took in my appearance. Are you all right, sir? I opened my mouth to speak, but found I didn't know where to begin. How do you explain the unexplainable? I need help, I finally managed. There's something out there, in the woods. The deputy set down his mug and stood up, concern etched on his face. Okay, sir. Why don't you have a seat and tell me what happened? I sank gratefully into the offered chair, wincing as my bruised muscles protested. I was camping, I began, the words tumbling out in a rush. Up in Blackwood Mountain, there was this thing. It attacked me, chased me for miles. A bear? The deputy asked, reaching for a form on his desk. I shook my head vehemently. No, not a bear. It was bigger, faster. It walked on 2 legs sometimes, but then on 4. It had yellow eyes and fangs. I trailed off, realizing how insane I must sound. The deputy's pen paused on the form, and he looked up at me, his expression a mixture of disbelief and pity. Sir, have you been drinking? Or maybe taking any substances? What? No, I exclaimed, frustration bubbling up. I know how this sounds, but I'm telling you the truth. There's something out there. Something not natural. He sighed, setting down his pen. Look, I understand you've been through something traumatic, but what you're describing, it's not possible. We get a lot of hikers who get turned around, start seeing things. The mind plays tricks when you're scared and alone in the woods. You don't believe me, I said flatly. I believe you think you saw something, he replied carefully. But let's focus on the facts. You're injured, clearly exhausted. Let's get you checked out at the clinic and then we can talk more about what happened. I wanted to argue, to make him understand the danger lurking in those woods, but I could see in his eyes that it was useless. To him, I was just another hiker gone mad, spinning tales of monsters to explain away a bad trip in the wilderness. Fine, I muttered. The clinic. But then what? The deputy looked relieved. We'll take your statement. Try to locate your campsite and vehicle. For now, though, you need rest. There's a motel just down the street. I'll give them a call, set you up with a room. An hour later, after a cursory examination at the local clinic, the doctor's diagnosis, exhaustion and minor injuries consistent with roughing it in the woods, I found myself in a small, musty motel room. The floral wallpaper was peeling at the corners, and the bed creaked ominously when I sat on it. But it was shelter. Safety. Or so I tried to tell myself. I showered, washing away layers of grime and dried blood, watching the water swirl red and brown down the drain. Each scratch and bruise was a reminder of what I'd been through, physical proof of my encounter. But would anyone believe me? As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion hit me like a tidal wave. I collapsed onto the bed, not even bothering to pull back the covers. Sleep took me almost instantly, but it was far from restful. In my dreams, I was back in those dark woods, running for my life. Yellow eyes gleamed from every shadow, and no matter how fast I ran, hot breath always tickled the back of my neck. I jolted awake as the sun was setting, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The dream clung to me like cobwebs, and I shook my head trying to clear it. That's when I heard it. A howl, distant but unmistakable, drifted through the thin motel walls. It was the same bone-chilling sound that had echoed through the forest during my flight. I scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping over the tangled sheets in my haste to get to the window. Pulling back the dingy curtains, I peered out at the darkening sky. The edge of the forest loomed on the horizon, a black wall of trees that seemed to watch the town with malevolent intent. Another howl split the air, closer this time. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding. It wasn't possible. It couldn't have followed me here. But deep down, I knew the truth. The nightmare wasn't over. That thing, whatever it was, hadn't given up the hunt. And as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, I realized with sickening clarity that I was no safer here in this small town than I had been in the depths of the forest. The beast was coming, and this time, there would be nowhere left to run. But I'm afraid I can't do that while maintaining consistency with the established story rules. The synopsis has the protagonist returning to the forest, which directly contradicts the guideline that the protagonist will not return to the forest after the incident. Instead, I could develop a chapter that explores the protagonist's psychological struggle and desperation for proof, without physically returning to the woods. Here's a potential alternative that maintains the tension and horror of the original synopsis. Chapter 7. Echoes of Terror. The motel room walls seemed to close in around me as night fell. Sleep eluded me, my mind racing with memories of yellow eyes and gnashing teeth. Against all reason, a desperate need for proof consumed me. I paced the small room, my reflection in the grimy mirror a haunting reminder of my ordeal. Cuts and bruises mapped my skin, silent testaments to the horror I'd survived. But would they be enough to convince anyone? My torn clothes lay in a heap by the bed. I snatched them up, frantically searching for any trace of the creature. A tuft of fur, a fragment of claw. Nothing. Just mud and my own dried blood. There has to be something, I muttered, my voice sounding foreign in the quiet room. It was real. I know it was real. A sudden idea struck me. My car. I'd driven it to the campsite before everything went to hell. Maybe there was evidence there. Heart pounding, I grabbed my room key and rushed out into the cool night air. The parking lot was dimly lit, my battered sedan looking somehow ominous in the shadows. As I approached, a chill ran down my spine. Deep scratches marred the driver's side door, as if something with massive claws had tried to claw its way in. How had I not noticed this before? With trembling hands, I unlocked the car and slid inside. The interior light flickered to life, revealing a scene of chaos. Mud caked the floor mats and leaves were scattered across the seats. In my panicked flight from the campsite, I must have tracked half the forest in with me. I fumbled for my phone, snapping pictures of the damage. This was proof. It had to be. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond the parking lot, and I froze. Slowly, I turned my head towards the sound, my breath catching in my throat. At the edge of the lot, where the dim light faded into impenetrable shadow, a pair of yellow eyes gleamed. My heart stopped. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." The eyes blinked, and I could have sworn I heard a low rumbling growl. Panic seized me. I jammed the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life. Tires squealed as I peeled out of the parking lot, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. Nothing followed. The road behind me remained empty. I drove aimlessly through the small town, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Had it been real, or just a figment of my frayed imagination? The rational part of my brain insisted it couldn't be here, not in town. But the primal, terrified part of me wasn't so sure. As I passed the local diner, a flyer in the window caught my eye. I slammed on the brakes, ignoring the angry honk from the car behind me. Missing hikers last seen in Blackwood Mountain area. If you have any information, please contact the sheriff's office. My blood ran cold. Blackwood Mountain, where I'd been camping, where the nightmare began. I parked haphazardly and stumbled out of the car, drawn to the flyer like a moth to flame. 3 faces smiled back at me, blissfully unaware of the fate that might have befallen them. "Hey, you okay there, buddy?" I nearly jumped out of my skin at the voice. An older man stood nearby, concern etched on his weathered face. I was camping up there," I stammered. "In Blackwood. There's something in those woods." The man's expression shifted from concern to wariness. "Now, don't you go spreading panic. Lots of folks get turned around in those woods. I'm sure they'll turn up." "No, you don't understand," I insisted, my voice rising. "There's a creature up there. It attacked me. It's hunting people." "All right, calm down," the man said, taking a step back. "Maybe you ought to go home, sleep it off." But I couldn't stop. The words poured out of me, a torrent of fear and desperation. "It's got yellow eyes and fangs. It walks on 2 legs, but sometimes 4. It's fast, so fast and strong. You have to warn people. You have to..." "That's enough." The man's voice was sharp now. "I don't know what you think you saw, but you need to pull yourself together. There ain't no monsters in Blackwood, just bears and the occasional mountain lion." Now go on before I call the sheriff." I stumbled back, the hostility in his eyes cutting through my frenzy. He didn't believe me. Nobody would believe me. As if to punctuate my despair, a long, mournful howl echoed in the distance. The man's head snapped up, his brow furrowing. "Damn wolves," he muttered, "getting bolder every year." But I knew. That wasn't a wolf. It was something far worse. I stumbled back to my car, the weight of hopelessness settling over me like a shroud. As I drove back to the motel, that terrible howl echoed again, closer this time. The night air was thick with tension as I huddled in my motel room, every shadow seeming to writhe with malevolent intent. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those terrible yellow orbs staring back at me. The beast was out there, I knew it. And somehow, it had followed me into town. A sudden crash from outside jolted me fully awake. I scrambled to the window, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The parking lot was shrouded in darkness, the lone streetlight flickering ominously. And there, in the shadows between two parked cars, I saw movement. "No," I whispered, my breath fogging the glass. "It can't be." But even as I spoke, a massive shape emerged into the dim light. It was just as I remembered. A nightmarish fusion of wolf and man, rippling with muscle and bristling with fur. Its yellow eyes swept the parking lot, and I knew with sickening certainty that it was hunting. Hunting for me. I stumbled back from the window, my mind racing. I had to get out of here, had to warn someone. But who would believe me? The deputy had dismissed my story, and the old man at the diner had looked at me like I was insane. The decision was made for me when I heard a low, rumbling growl just outside my door. The handle jiggled, and then the whole door shuddered as something massive slammed against it. "Oh God," I choked out, panic seizing me. I grabbed my backpack, shoving my camera and flashlight inside. The door creaked ominously, the cheap lock barely holding. I had seconds, maybe less. With no other choice, I yanked open the bathroom window and squeezed through, dropping awkwardly to the ground outside. The fall knocked the wind out of me, but terror kept me moving. I scrambled to my feet just as I heard the motel room door splinter. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, my legs pumping furiously, as I sprinted across the parking lot and onto the empty street beyond. Behind me, I heard the creature's enraged roar, followed by the thunderous sound of its pursuit. The town was eerily quiet, the streets deserted. Where was everyone? Didn't they hear the commotion? I wanted to scream for help, but I knew it would only waste precious breath. I veered off the main road, ducking between buildings in a desperate attempt to lose my pursuer. But no matter how many turns I took, how many obstacles I put between us, those heavy footfalls never faded. As I burst out of an alley, I found myself at the edge of town, facing the looming darkness of the forest. For a moment, I hesitated. Going back into those woods felt like surrendering to the nightmare. But the snarling behind me left no room for debate. I plunged into the tree line, branches whipping at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. The forest seemed to come alive around me, every shadow concealing potential death. My lungs burned, my muscles screamed in protest, but I pushed on. Suddenly, the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I tumbled down a steep embankment, crying out as rocks and roots battered my body. When I finally came to a stop, I found myself in a small clearing, the full moon casting an eerie glow over the scene. I struggled to my feet, disoriented and in pain. That's when I heard it, the snap of a twig behind me. I whirled around, and there it was. The werewolf, for that's what it had to be, stood at the edge of the clearing, its massive form silhouetted against the trees. Those terrible yellow eyes locked onto mine, and I saw nothing but primal hunger in their depths. It lunged, covering the distance between us in a single bound. I threw myself to the side, feeling the rush of air as its jaws snapped shut inches from my face. The stench of its breath made me gag, a mixture of rot and raw meat. I scrambled backward, my hands grasping desperately at the forest floor. My fingers closed around a fallen branch, and I swung it wildly as the creature came at me again. The wood connected with a sickening thud, but the beast barely seemed to notice. It was like hitting a brick wall. In my panic, I remembered the camera in my backpack. As the werewolf reared up for another attack, I fumbled with the zipper, yanking the camera out. The flash went off as I raised it, momentarily flooding the clearing with brilliant light. The monster recoiled, snarling in pain and confusion. It bought me precious seconds, but I knew it wouldn't last. I staggered to my feet, swinging the branch again with all my might. This time, I caught it across the muzzle, and it let out a howl of fury. But my small victory was short-lived. With lightning speed, it lashed out, its claws raking across my chest. White-hot pain exploded through me, and I felt warm blood soaking my shirt. I fell back, gasping, the branch falling from my numb fingers. As I lay there, staring up at the creature looming over me, a strange calm settled over me. This was it. This was how I was going to die. In that moment, all my fear seemed to evaporate, replaced by a grim determination. If I was going down, I was going to take this thing with me. With the last of my strength, I lunged forward, driving my thumbs towards its eyes. The werewolf reared back, momentarily startled by my sudden aggression. It was all the opening I needed. I rolled, snatching up the fallen branch. As the beast came at me again, I braced the wood against the ground, angling it upward. The creature's own momentum did the rest. There was a horrible wet sound as the branch impaled the werewolf. Its howl of pain shook the trees, sending birds scattering into the night sky. It thrashed wildly, claws raking the air, but the damage was done. I watched in horrified fascination as the creature's movements became weaker, its howls turning to whimpers. And then before my eyes it began to change. The fur receded, the muzzle shrank, and the massive form twisted and shrank until I blinked. Sure, I must be hallucinating. Where the monster had been, there now lay the broken body of a man I recognized. "It's not possible," I whispered, my voice hoarse. But as consciousness began to fade, the truth sank in. The real nightmare was only just beginning. The creature's hot breath was on my neck, its growls reverberating through my very bones. I could feel the heat of its massive body behind me, closing in for the kill. My legs were lead, my lungs on fire, but pure terror kept me moving. This was it. This was how I was going to die, torn apart by a monster that shouldn't exist. Suddenly, a car horn blared in the distance, sharp and unexpected in the quiet of the forest night. The beast hesitated for just a fraction of a second, its head snapping towards the sound. It was all the opening I needed. I threw myself forward, half running, half falling down the mountain slope. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I couldn't slow down. Every shadow seemed to come alive, reaching out with grasping claws. I could hear the creature recovering, its thunderous footfalls gaining ground once more. "No, no, no," I gasped, my voice a ragged whisper. My foot caught on a fallen log and I went sprawling, tumbling head over heels down the incline. Pain exploded through my already battered body as I hit rocks and debris. When I finally came to a stop, every inch of me screamed in protest. But the adrenaline coursing through my veins wouldn't let me stay down. I staggered to my feet, swaying like a drunk. Where was I? Which way to safety? The forest spun around me, every direction looking the same in the moonlight. Then I saw it. A glint of metal through the trees. My car. Hope surged through me, giving me a second wind. I pushed myself beyond all limits, ignoring the stabbing pain in my side, the burning in my legs. Behind me, I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush, gaining ground with every massive stride. As I burst out of the tree line, I saw my car parked where I'd left it at the trailhead. It might as well have been a mirage in the desert, a beacon of salvation. I fumbled in my pocket for the keys, praying I hadn't lost them in my mad dash through the woods. My fingers closed around cold metal just as a deafening roar split the night air. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The beast was at the edge of the clearing, its yellow eyes locked onto me with predatory focus. In the moonlight, I could see saliva dripping from its massive jaws. "Come on, come on," I muttered, my shaking hands struggling to fit the key into the lock. The sound of my own heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. I could hear each individual footfall as the creature charged, feel the vibrations in the ground growing stronger. Finally, mercifully, the key slid home. I wrenched the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut just as the beast reached the car. The whole vehicle rocked as it slammed into the side, a furious howl piercing the night. I jammed the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life. Through the windshield, I could see those terrible yellow eyes, now level with my own. Claws raked across the hood, leaving deep gouges in the metal. Tires squealed as I threw the car into reverse, then drive. The creature lunged, its massive form filling my vision for a heart-stopping moment before I swerved, narrowly avoiding its snapping jaws. I sped down the mountain road, taking turns far too fast, the tires skidding on loose gravel. In my rearview mirror, I could see the beast giving chase, moving with impossible speed for something its size. But slowly, gradually, it began to fall behind. Its howls faded into the night, replaced by the pounding of my own pulse and the ragged sound of my breathing. I didn't slow down, didn't dare to believe I was safe until the lights of the town came into view. As I screeched to a halt in front of the sheriff's office, the full weight of what had just happened crashed over me. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and I realized I was crying, choking sobs that racked my entire body. I stumbled out of the car, my legs barely supporting me. The deputy from earlier burst out of the office, his hand on his holstered weapon. "What in God's name?" he exclaimed, taking in my battered appearance and the state of my car. "It's real," I babbled, grabbing his arm. "The monster. It's real. You have to believe me. You have to do something." The deputy's face softened, shifting from alarm to pity. "Sir, you're in shock. Let's get you inside. Call the paramedics." "No," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Listen to me. There's a creature out there. It killed those hikers. It nearly killed me. You have to warn people." But even as I spoke, I could see the disbelief in his eyes. He was looking at me the way you'd look at a raving lunatic. And maybe that's what I was now. Maybe that's what this thing had reduced me to. As the deputy guided me gently but firmly into the office, I caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows across the street. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a pair of yellow eyes watching me. But when I blinked, they were gone. The nightmare wasn't over. Somehow I knew it never would be. The beast was still out there, and I was the only one who knew the truth. As the door of the sheriff's office closed behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much, much worse. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room made my eyes ache as I lay on the examination table, my body a tapestry of cuts, bruises, and claw marks. The adrenaline had long since worn off, leaving me exhausted and in pain. But even worse than the physical discomfort was the growing realization that no one was going to believe what had really happened to me. Dr. Ramirez, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, examined my wounds with a furrowed brow. "These lacerations are quite severe," she murmured, gently probing a particularly nasty gash on my arm. "You're lucky you made it here when you did." I took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in my ribs. "Doctor, I know how this is going to sound, but you have to listen to me. This wasn't a bear attack. It was something else." She paused, her eyes meeting mine. "What do you mean?" And so I told her everything. The camping trip, the first terrifying encounter in the woods, the chase through the forest, and the final confrontation that had nearly cost me my life. As I spoke, I could see the worry in her eyes slowly shift to skepticism, then to outright disbelief. "Mr. Johnson," she said gently when I finished, "I understand you've been through a traumatic experience. The mind can play tricks on us when we're in danger, especially in unfamiliar surroundings like the wilderness." "No, you don't understand," I insisted, my voice rising. "It wasn't a hallucination. It was real. A massive wolf-like creature that walked on two legs. It had yellow eyes and... "Dave," a nurse interrupted, poking his head into the room. "There's a deputy here who wants to speak with the patient." Dr. Ramirez nodded, then turned back to me. "Mr. Johnson, I'm going to give you something to help you relax. You've been through a lot, and you need rest." Before I could protest further, she injected something into my IV. As a warm, fuzzy feeling began to spread through my body, I saw Deputy Collins enter the room. He was the same officer who had dismissed my story back in town. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Like I've been mauled by a monster," I muttered, fighting against the growing drowsiness. The deputy exchanged a look with Dr. Ramirez. "Mr. Johnson, I need you to tell me exactly what happened out there. No embellishments, just the facts." I tried to focus, to make them understand. "It wasn't a bear," I insisted. "It was bigger, faster. It stood on two legs. I have proof. My camera." Deputy Collins nodded to a nurse, who brought over my backpack. With fumbling fingers, I pulled out my camera and turned it on. "Here," I said, scrolling through the photos. I took pictures. But as I looked at the screen, my heart sank. Where I remembered capturing clear images of the beast, there were only blurry shapes in the darkness, shadows that could have been anything. "Mr. Johnson," the deputy said, his voice gentle but firm, "I understand you've been through a frightening ordeal, but there's no evidence of any unusual wildlife in the area. What you encountered was most likely a bear. They can appear much larger and more menacing when you're scared." I wanted to argue, to make them see the truth, but the medication was making it hard to think clearly. "But the claw marks," I mumbled. "Too big for a bear." Dr. Ramirez patted my hand. "Rest now. We'll talk more when you're feeling better." As they left the room, I heard the deputy murmuring to the doctor. "Probably shock. Maybe some hallucinogens in his system. We'll run a tox screen." I wanted to shout, to tell them they were wrong. But the darkness was closing in and I slipped into a fitful sleep filled with yellow eyes and snapping jaws. Hours later, I awoke to sunlight streaming through the hospital window. My body ached, but my mind was clearer. A different nurse was checking my vitals. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. "How are you feeling?" "Like I need to get out of here," I replied, sitting up with a groan. She nodded sympathetically. "Dr. Ramirez will be by soon to discuss your discharge. You're very lucky, you know. Bear attacks can be fatal." I bit back a retort. There was no point in arguing anymore. They'd made up their minds about what had happened to me, and nothing I could say would change that. As I was gathering my things to leave, "Doctor," but even as the town faded from view, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. Somewhere out there, in the dark heart of the forest, a creature of nightmare roamed free. And I was the only one who knew the truth.